Somewhere in southern Africa, a woman kneels at the mouth of a cave above a cold grey sea. It is night, and the fire behind her throws long shadows across a wall stained by centuries of smoke. She is grinding a lump of red ochre against a flat stone slowly, patiently, the way her mother taught her. She does not know it, but she is one of only a few thousand people left on the entire planet. Not a few thousand in her valley, not a few thousand in her country, a few thousand in the world. Somewhere far to the north, the ice has not stopped growing in longer than anyone can remember. Somewhere to the east, ash still drifts down from a sky that turned strange years ago, settling on leaves like grey snow that never melts. The woman does not know about the ice or the ash or the sky. She only knows that the fish come less often now, that the nights are colder than her grandmother described them, and that fewer children are born each year than the year before. She keeps grinding the ochre. It is a small, steady act, the kind of thing a person does simply because tomorrow is coming, whether or not it feels certain. What she does not know, what no one alive then could have known, is that this era would come to be remembered tens of thousands of years later, as the moment our entire species nearly blinked out of existence. Scientists who study our DNA would one day look at the genes carried by every human being on Earth and find something strange in them. A kind of narrowness, a signature of scarcity, the unmistakable fingerprint of a population that had fallen, and fallen hard, and only barely climbed back. Why did it happen? What did they face? And how, against odds that seem almost impossible to imagine, did any of us come to be here at all? If you enjoy documentaries like this to fall asleep to, subscribe. I post a new mystery like this every week. To understand how close we came to disappearing, you have to stop thinking in years and start thinking in people. Not years, people. Because the strangest part of this mystery was never really about a date. It was about a number. A small, quiet, almost unbelievable number. Somewhere around 74,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years either way, the population of Homo sapiens on the entire planet may have dropped to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding adults. Not 1,000 in Africa, not 10,000 in one region. That was the estimate for the whole species, everywhere, combined. Sit with that for a moment. Right now, a single mid-sized university has more students walking across its campus than there may have been humans left on Earth during this period. A single football stadium, half filled, could have held our entire species and left rows of empty seats. This is not a comfortable thing to imagine, and yet there is something oddly calming about it too in its own way. Because it means every person who has ever lived since, every civilization, every language, every song sung in every corner of the world, grew from a population so small it could have fit inside a modest town. We are all of us the descendants of survivors, not conquerors, not the strongest necessarily or the smartest, simply the ones who did not go out. The evidence for this bottleneck does not come from bones, at least not primarily. It comes from something quieter and, in its way, more intimate. It comes from inside us. Every strand of DNA in every human body carries a kind of memory, written not in words but in patterns of variation, or the lack of it. When a population is large and stable across a long stretch of time, that DNA tends to accumulate diversity, small differences scattered across millions of individuals, evidence of a deep and branching family tree with countless independent lines stretching back through time. When a population crashes, something different happens. Most of those branches are simply cut away. The people carrying them do not survive to pass their particular genetic signature forward. And when the population recovers afterward, when the numbers climb back up over the following centuries and millennia, the new larger population is descended from only the branches that made it through the narrow part of the funnel. The diversity of the ancestors is gone, even though the descendants may number in the billions. Geneticists have a name for this. They call it a population bottleneck, and they can, in a strange act of reading, detect its shadow inside the genome of every living person. Human beings, it turns out, are remarkably alike to one another at the genetic level, far more alike than chimpanzees are to other chimpanzees, even though there are billions of us and only a few 100,000 of them left in scattered pockets of forest. For decades, this observation puzzled researchers. If our numbers grew so explosively, why does our species show so little internal genetic variation, compared to far smaller populations of other primates? The answer that has slowly taken shape, drawn from mitochondrial DNA passed down only through mothers, and Y chromosome DNA passed down only through fathers, and now increasingly from whole genome studies that draw on both lines at once, is that something happened. Somewhere in the deep past our numbers fell low enough and stayed low long enough that the genetic shadow of that narrowing is still visible today, tens of thousands of generations later. The timing keeps circling back to roughly the same window. Different studies, using different methods and different assumptions, have proposed dates that cluster loosely around 70,000 to 80,000 years before the present. Some estimates push a little earlier, some a little later. The uncertainty is real, and any honest account of this mystery has to hold that uncertainty gently, rather than pretending to a precision the evidence doesn't quite support, but the rough window keeps reappearing, study after study like an old bruise that keeps showing through new skin. And it lines up unnervingly with something else, something that has nothing to do with genetics at all, and everything to do with rock and ash and a single mountain on the other side of the world from where most of our ancestors were living at the time. But we will come to that later. For now, sit with the scale of it. Try to imagine what a population of a few thousand actually looks like, spread not across a city or even a single country, but scattered in small bands across an entire continent, or perhaps two. Groups of 20, 30, maybe 50 people. A family here. A cluster of families a few days' walk away. Long stretches of empty land between them where no human voice had been heard in years. In a group that small, a single hard winter could take a grandmother and 2 children. A single bad hunting season could leave a band of 30 reduced to 20 by spring. The kind of loss that today would register as a private grief, contained within a handful of families, was then arithmetic on a species-wide scale. Every death mattered more, because there were so few people left to carry the pattern forward. Archaeologists who study this period sometimes describe it, carefully and without exaggeration, as one of the tightest margins our species has ever walked. Not the only hard period, certainly. Human history since has been full of famine and plague and war. But those later crises happened to populations already numbering in the hundreds of thousands or millions. This crisis, if it was a single crisis at all, happened to a population that may have been smaller than a modern small town. There is something almost meditative in trying to picture it precisely, not a catastrophe with a single dramatic moment, no explosion caught on film, no headline, no single night when everything changed. Just a slow tightening. Fewer births surviving into adulthood, fewer bands encountering each other to trade partners and stories and tools, territories contracting as resources thinned. A world that, for the people living through it, would not have felt like an ending so much as a long, hard, ordinary-seeming stretch of difficult years, one following another, with no way of knowing from the inside whether it would ever loosen its grip. That is, in some ways, the quietest and strangest part of this mystery. The people who lived through what may have been our species' closest brush with extinction almost certainly did not know they were living through anything unusual at all. They did not have a name for what was happening to them. They only had winters to survive and children to feed and fires to keep lit through nights that, for reasons they could not have understood, seemed to be growing colder and stranger with each passing year. We know now roughly where some of these last strongholds may have been. Along certain stretches of the southern African coast, caves tucked into limestone cliffs above the sea have yielded some of the richest archaeological records from this exact window of time. Places with names now given by the archaeologists who found them: Pinnacle Point, Blombos, Clayses River, Sibidu, sites that, layer by careful layer, preserve traces of people who were living, cooking, working stone, grinding pigment, and gathering shellfish along this coastline during precisely the centuries when the rest of the genetic and climatic evidence suggests our numbers were at their thinnest. It is tempting, and not unreasonable, to wonder whether these coastal refuges were among the very places where the narrowest part of the bottleneck occurred, whether the low, steady rhythm of tides going in and out along that shoreline was, in some very real sense, the sound our entire species' future was listening to, one wave at a time without knowing it. The scale of what nearly happened is difficult to hold in the mind for long, precisely because it is so at odds with what came after. We know how this story turns out. We know that within a relatively short span of time, geologically speaking, a matter of tens of thousands of years, human populations would begin to grow again, spread again, cross land bridges and open water in small boats, reach Australia, reach the far edges of Asia, eventually cross into the Americas. We know that this same tiny, narrowed population would go on to build cities and write books, and eventually sit somewhere warm, listening to a story like this one, drifting towards sleep. But at the time, none of that was written anywhere. There was no guarantee, no plan, no destiny humming quietly beneath the surface of things. There was only a small number of people, scattered thin across a wide and increasingly difficult world, doing the small daily things that keep a person and their children alive one more day. Gathering, grinding, watching the sky, tending the fire. There is a further wrinkle in the genetic story worth mentioning, one that adds real texture to the picture rather than simplifying it. Different regions of the human genome appear to preserve slightly different signals of this ancient bottleneck, and reconciling those differences has occupied population geneticists for years. Some regions of the genome, particularly those less subject to the pressures of natural selection, tend to preserve a cleaner, more straightforward record of population size over time, since they drift according to fairly predictable statistical rules. Other regions, shaped more heavily by selection pressures acting on specific genes, for immune function, for skin pigmentation, for countless other traits, can show patterns that are harder to interpret purely in terms of population size, since selection itself can narrow or widen genetic variation, independent of how many people were actually alive at any given time. This means that estimating the exact severity of the bottleneck requires careful, painstaking work to separate the pure demographic signal, the actual number of people alive, from the more complicated evolutionary signal layered on top of it. It is a bit like trying to determine the exact water level of a lake by examining mineral deposits left on the surrounding rocks, when some of those deposits were left by the water itself, and others were left by unrelated geological processes happening on their own timeline. Untangling the two requires real expertise, and reasonable, careful scientists can and do disagree about exactly how to weight different pieces of evidence. What keeps drawing researchers back to roughly the same broad conclusion, despite this complexity, is the sheer consistency of the underlying signal across so many different, independently developed analytical approaches, even accounting for every reasonable source of uncertainty and disagreement about the exact severity and exact timing. The broad shape of the story remains remarkably stable across decades of increasingly sophisticated genetic research. Something happened to our species' population during this general window of deep prehistory. It fell, meaningfully and measurably, from whatever earlier, larger numbers our ancestors may have sustained, and it recovered, eventually, though from a starting point narrow enough that its shadow persists in every human genome examined since. It is worth pausing here before we go further into what may have caused this narrowing, to simply notice what it means that we are here at all to wonder about it. Every single person who has ever lived since that period, every ancestor of every person listening to this right now passed through that narrow place. Not most of them, all of them. There is no lineage, no family line anywhere on Earth today that did not thread its way through that same thin stretch of time. In a strange way, it means we're all, quite literally, distant cousins descended from the same small handful of survivors. The scale of the crisis, once so vast and species-threatening, becomes, from this distance, almost intimate, a shared inheritance, a thread we all hold together, even if none of us can see where it begins. So what happened? What could press an entire species down to such a fragile margin? The clues, as it turns out, come from several directions at once. From ice sitting frozen in glaciers on the far side of the world, from ash buried in soil thousands of miles from where it fell, and from a mountain in what is now Indonesia that, for 1 week, roughly 74,000 years ago, did something no volcano has done in the entire span of recorded human history. We will walk toward that mountain slowly. There is no need to rush. The story has waited 74,000 years already. It can wait a little longer while we look, carefully, at how the pieces first began to come together. In the decades since researchers first proposed a connection between a shrinking human population and a single, catastrophic event, the picture has grown both richer and more uncertain, the way most good mysteries do the closer you look at them. New evidence has come in from ice cores, from lake sediments, from deep-sea drilling projects, from painstaking archaeological excavation. Some of it supports the original idea, some of it complicates it. All of it deepens the picture of just how strange and fragile this period in our history really was. What no one disputes, though, is the underlying shape of the mystery itself. Something happened. The population fell, low enough and long enough to leave its mark in the genes of every person alive today. And whatever it was, our ancestors somehow endured it, huddled in scattered pockets around the edges of a changing world, waiting, though they could not have known they were waiting, for things to loosen their grip. It helps to understand a little more about how researchers actually arrive at a number, like a few thousand breeding adults, because the method itself is almost as remarkable as the conclusion. Population geneticists use a concept called effective population size, a careful statistical estimate of how many individuals would have been required, breeding under idealized conditions to produce the exact pattern of genetic variation observed in a population today. It is not a literal head count. It is closer to a mathematical shadow, cast backward through time by the pattern still visible in living DNA. Multiple independent lines of genetic evidence converge on a similar range for this period. Studies of mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through the maternal line, suggest a narrow effective population size clustering in the low thousands. Separate studies of the Y chromosome inherited only through the paternal line arrive at broadly comparable figures, though with their own particular uncertainties. More recent whole genome studies, drawing on far larger and more complex datasets that incorporate DNA inherited from both parents across many different chromosomes, have refined these estimates further, some suggesting the bottleneck may have been somewhat less severe than the earlier studies proposed, others confirming a genuinely dramatic and sustained period of population contraction. This convergence across independent methods, using different portions of the genome and different statistical approaches, is part of what gives the bottleneck theory its scientific weight. It would be one thing if a single study, using a single method, had produced this narrow estimate. It is something else entirely when mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA, and broader whole genome analyses, developed by different research teams working independently and sometimes skeptically of each other's conclusions, all point toward roughly the same narrow window of population history. There is a second, quieter kind of evidence worth mentioning here as well, one that comes not from population geneticists studying deep history, but from medical researchers studying disease in the present. Human beings today show a level of genetic similarity to one another, at certain specific locations across the genome, that has real practical consequences. Compared to many other species, humans show a narrower range of variation at several of these critical genetic markers, a pattern consistent with a relatively recent, relatively severe population bottleneck having passed through our ancestral line, still visible in the blood of every person alive. None of this evidence on its own proves exactly what caused the bottleneck. It simply confirms from multiple independent angles that the bottleneck itself is real, and that its timing sits squarely within this narrow window of deep prehistory that keeps reappearing across so many different kinds of evidence. The population did fall. It fell low enough to leave a lasting, measurable trace in every human body alive today. And it recovered, eventually, from a base so narrow that the genetic shadow of that narrowing has never fully disappeared, even after tens of thousands of years and billions of subsequent births. But waiting is where we turn next, because surviving a bottleneck like this one was not a matter of luck alone. It required a set of skills, a body of accumulated knowledge, passed carefully from one generation to the next, that allowed a small number of people to do something remarkable, not merely to endure, to adapt, quietly and cleverly, to a world that seemed, in every visible way, to be turning against them. Survival, when a population is this small and this exposed, is never really about strength. It is about knowledge. Small, patient, accumulated knowledge, passed down through hands and voices rather than written records, refined generation after generation, until it became the difference between a band that made it through the winter and one that did not. Along that southern African coastline, in the caves where so much of the physical evidence from this period survives, archaeologists have found something that, on the surface, looks almost mundane. Shells. Thousands upon thousands of them, layered into the cave floors in thick, compacted bands, the discarded remains of meals eaten tens of thousands of years ago. Brown mussels, limpets, whelks, the humble, unglamorous protein of the tide line. But look closer, and the shell middens tell a quieter and more remarkable story. These are not the leavings of people stumbling upon the occasional shellfish by accident. They are the leavings of people who understood the rhythm of the tides with the kind of precision that only comes from generations of careful observation. Certain shellfish species are only exposed during specific phases of the tidal cycle, at specific times of the lunar month. To gather them reliably, safely, and in enough quantity to matter, you need to know not just where to look, but exactly when. This matters more than it might seem to at first. A coastline is one of the very few environments on Earth that offers a steady, dependable source of food, regardless of drought, regardless of the failure of inland game herds, regardless of the state of the plant life a few miles further from the water. Shellfish do not disappear during a bad season the way antelope or edible roots might. They are simply there, waiting for low tide, waiting for someone who knows when and where to look. In a period when everything else in the world seems to be tightening, when herds are thinner, when familiar plants are less reliable, when the climate itself seems to have shifted into a colder, drier, harsher register, a dependable coastal food source is not a small advantage. It may have been the advantage. Some researchers have gone as far as to suggest that the ability to exploit marine resources with this kind of skill and consistency may have been one of the key reasons that certain small pockets of humanity managed to survive this period at all, while other bands, further from the coast and more dependent on increasingly unreliable inland resources, simply thinned away and vanished. It is worth sitting with the picture for a moment. A small group, perhaps 30 or 40 people, moving down to the rocks each morning as the tide begins to pull back, gathering shellfish into simple containers, watching the horizon, watching the sky, watching each other's children playing at the edge of the surf while the adults worked. A rhythm repeated so many mornings, across so many years, that it became less a strategy than simply the shape of a life. The caves themselves, the ones where this evidence survives, were not chosen randomly either. They sit tucked into limestone cliffs, elevated enough to be safe from all but the most extreme storm surges, oriented to catch the morning sun and shelter from the worst of the prevailing wind, close enough to fresh water and to the tide line to make daily life practical, but defensible. Enclosed. A place where a fire could be kept burning through the night without being extinguished by rain or wind coming in off the sea. Inside those caves, the evidence of fire is everywhere. Not campfires in the casual occasional sense, but hearths, carefully maintained, repeatedly used, built up in some places into thick, complex layers of ash and burned earth that record years, sometimes generations, of continuous or near-continuous use in the same spot. Fire, at this point in our history, was no longer simply a tool that had been discovered. It had become something closer to a technology, refined and applied with real sophistication. One of the more remarkable discoveries from this period concerns something you would not expect to find any deliberate craft in at all: stone. Ordinary stone tools, the kind our ancestors had been making in broadly similar ways for a very long time before this. But researchers working at sites along this coastline noticed something odd about certain stone artifacts from this exact window of the past. Their colour and texture suggested they had been heated, deliberately, before being worked into their final shape. It turns out that certain types of stone, when heated slowly and carefully in a bed of hot sand beneath a fire for an extended period, sometimes as long as a full day or more, undergo a subtle transformation. Their internal structure changes in a way that makes them easier to flake into sharp, precise edges. The technique, sometimes called heat treatment, requires real understanding. Too much heat, too quickly, and the stone shatters uselessly. Too little, and nothing changes at all. Getting it right requires controlling a fire's temperature over many hours, monitoring it, tending it, understanding a material's behaviour in a way that could only have come from patient, repeated experimentation passed down and refined across many hands and many years. Think about what that represents. A population reduced to a few thousand people, scattered thin, facing a harsher and less forgiving world than their ancestors had known. And yet, in the middle of all of that pressure, still finding the time, the stability, and the intellectual curiosity to refine a technique this subtle. Heat-treating stone does not solve an immediate crisis. It is not something a person invents in a single desperate afternoon. It is the kind of quiet technical mastery that only develops in a population with enough stability, generation after generation, to sit with a problem and slowly work it out. This is, in a way, one of the gentler surprises of this whole period. We tend to imagine population bottlenecks and near extinctions as periods of pure desperation, pure survival, stripped of anything but the most basic struggle to stay alive, and there was certainly struggle. But the archaeological record from these coastal refuges does not read like the record of a population in constant, unrelenting crisis. It reads like the record of people living careful, structured, even occasionally reflective lives, even while the margins around them were narrowing. There is other evidence, too, of a kind of behaviour that goes beyond simple survival altogether. In the same layers of cave sediment that preserve the shell middens and the heat-treated stone tools, archaeologists have found small pieces of ochre, a soft, reddish stone that can be ground into a fine, richly coloured powder. Some of these ochre pieces bear deliberate, deep scratch marks, not the accidental scuffs of use, but patterns. Cross-hatched lines, geometric grids, marks made with intention, using a sharpened point, on a piece of stone that served no obvious practical purpose at all. No one can say with certainty what these markings meant to the people who made them. They are far too old and far too disconnected from any living tradition for anyone to translate them with confidence. But the fact of their existence tells us something important. This was not a population so consumed by survival that there was no room left over for anything else. There was room, even in the narrowest, hardest years, for a person to sit by a fire, take a piece of soft red stone and carefully, deliberately, scratch a pattern into it that meant something to them, even if it means nothing decodable to us now, tens of thousands of years later. Some of the ochre found at these sites was clearly processed for use as pigment, ground down and mixed, likely for use on skin or on tools, or perhaps in ways connected to ritual or belief that we simply cannot reconstruct from stone and residue alone. In one particularly striking find, archaeologists uncovered what appears to be a kind of ancient workshop. A small collection of tools, a shell that had been used as a mixing container, and traces of a red, ochre-based compound, all left behind together in a single spot, undisturbed, as though someone had simply set down their materials one day and never returned to finish the work. It is a strange thing to look at an object like that and feel the pull of a story you can never actually hear. Someone sat here. Someone mixed this pigment for some purpose that mattered enough to them to gather the materials and do the careful work of preparation, and then, for reasons lost entirely to time, they never came back to use it. The survival strategies of this period, then, were not simply about calories and shelter, although those mattered enormously. They were about a kind of accumulated cultural sophistication, knowledge of tides, mastery of fire, patient technical experimentation, and apparently some capacity for symbolic or decorative behaviour that had nothing directly to do with staying alive at all. It is tempting to wonder whether that capacity, that willingness to spend scarce time and energy on things beyond the immediate demands of survival, was itself part of what allowed these small bands to hold together. Shared symbols, shared rituals, shared marks scratched into stone may have helped bind small, isolated groups into something more cohesive, more cooperative, more able to share resources and knowledge and support each other through hard years than a purely individualistic strategy for survival ever could have. We cannot know this for certain. The people who lived through this period left us stone and shell and ochre and ash, but they did not leave us their words, their names, their explanations. Everything we reconstruct about their inner lives is an inference built carefully from physical traces and held, always, with the humility that comes from knowing how much more must have existed than what happened to survive in the archaeological record. But the traces that do survive suggest something worth holding on to as we continue this story. However narrow the margins became, however close our species came to slipping away entirely, the people living through it were not simply passive victims of circumstance. They were paying close attention to their world. They were experimenting, refining, teaching each other, and finding room, even under pressure, for small acts of meaning that reach beyond mere survival. It is difficult, and maybe unnecessary, to draw too neat a lesson from any of this. but there is something quietly moving in the thought that even in the hardest, thinnest years our species has ever known, someone still sat by a fire and turned a piece of red stone over in their hands and decided it was worth marking. There is a particular kind of stone tool associated with this period and this region that deserves its own closer look because it captures something important about the mindset of the people making it. Archaeologists call the broader technological tradition associated with several of these southern African sites the Stilbay and Howiesons Poort industries, named, as is common in archaeology, after the specific sites where these particular styles of toolmaking were first clearly identified and described. What sets these traditions apart from earlier stone tool technologies is not simply the shapes of the finished tools, but the complexity of the process required to make them. Producing one of these finely worked bifacial points, tools flaked carefully on both surfaces into a symmetrical leaf-shaped blade, required a sequence of deliberate steps, each one dependent on the one before it. Selecting the right raw material, preparing a rough shape through a first round of careful flaking, heat-treating the stone in many cases to alter its internal structure before the final, most delicate shaping could even begin. Then a final stage of extremely careful, controlled pressure flaking, using a small tool, likely made of bone or antler, to remove thin, precise flakes along the edges, creating a tool both sharp and symmetrical in a way that required real, hand-eye coordination and years of practice skill to achieve reliably. This is not the kind of skill a person invents alone, in a single afternoon, out of pure necessity. It is the kind of skill that has to be taught, patiently, by someone who already knows how to do it, to someone who does not yet know, across many repeated attempts, many failures, many small corrections offered gently across a shared fire. Children, in a band like this, would have grown up watching this process from the time they were old enough to sit still and pay attention, absorbing the rhythm of it long before they were given stone of their own to practice on. This matters more than it might first appear to in the context of a population under this kind of pressure. A skill this complex represents a genuine investment of a band's limited time and attention that could, in principle, have been spent instead on more immediately urgent tasks. That bands facing real environmental pressure continue to invest in teaching and refining a technology, this intricate suggests something meaningful about their circumstances. They were not living in a state of constant, desperate crisis so severe that nothing beyond the most basic hour-to-hour survival was possible. They had enough stability, at least in these particular coastal refuges, to continue investing in long-term skills, the kind of skills that only pay off across years and successive generations, rather than in any single immediate emergency. There is an interesting pattern in how these particular tool-making traditions appear and disappear in the archaeological record across this broader period. The Stilbay tradition, along with several related technological traditions from roughly this window, appears at multiple sites, persists for a period of time, and then seems to vanish from the record, replaced by simpler, less labour-intensive tool-making approaches, before more elaborate traditions occasionally reappear again later. Some researchers have proposed that these fluctuations may themselves track the rising and falling pressures of this difficult period. In good years, when a band had a little more security, a little more surplus time, there may have been more room to invest in elaborate technologies, in decorative ochre work, in the patient teaching of intricate skills to the next generation. In harder years, when survival demanded every available hour, some of this more elaborate cultural investment may have simply been set aside, not because the knowledge was lost, but because there was no time to spare for anything beyond the most essential and immediate tasks. This gives us a subtly different way of imagining this period than a single, uniform story of crisis. It suggests something closer to a long series of tides, in a very real, if metaphorical sense, mirroring the literal tides these coastal populations were reading so carefully along the shore. Periods of relative ease, when culture and technology and decoration could flourish a little more freely. Periods of relative hardship, when everything contracted back down to the essentials, and through it all the underlying core of knowledge, the fire-making, the tide reading, the basic outlines of stone tool production, persisting, passed down carefully enough that even after a harder stretch of years, the more elaborate traditions could sometimes be picked back up again, not reinvented from nothing, but recovered from a store of knowledge that had never fully disappeared, even when it went quiet in the archaeological record for a while. It is worth imagining too what it might have meant to be a child growing up during one of the harder stretches within this longer story. A child who might never see an elder shape one of the elaborate, finely worked bifacial points, because the band's circumstances during those particular years did not allow for that kind of patient investment, and yet that same child would still have grown up watching a fire tended with total reliability, watching adults read a tide table written nowhere but in careful, remembered observation, watching the ordinary daily competence that kept them all alive, even in a year when nothing beyond the essential was possible. Competence, in other words, did not require elaboration to matter. The quieter, more basic skills, tending fire, reading tides, working simple, effective stone tools, were themselves a form of accumulated wisdom every bit as impressive, in their own understated way, as the more elaborate technologies that sometimes flourished alongside them in better years. The next layer of this mystery asks a different kind of question. Not simply how our ancestors survived day to day, but what specifically they may have been surviving against. Because for all the skill and care visible in these coastal sites, something out there in the wider world was pressing down on human populations everywhere, not just along this one stretch of African coastline. And to understand what that pressure might have been, we have to look somewhere much further away and much colder, to ice that has been sitting quietly, layer upon layer, at the top and bottom of the world for tens of thousands of years, patiently keeping a record that no human witness ever could. Far from that African coastline, in places no human being from this period ever walked, a different kind of archive was being written, not in stone or shell, but in snow. In Greenland and in Antarctica, snow falling year after year compacts slowly under its own weight, trapping tiny bubbles of the atmosphere that existed the moment it fell. Layer builds on layer, century after century, millennium after millennium, until what began as loose snowfall becomes solid ice, hundreds and eventually thousands of meters thick. When scientists drill down into that ice and pull up a long cylindrical core, they are in a very real sense pulling up a diary. Each layer can be counted, much like the rings of a tree, and dated with increasing precision the closer it sits to the surface. And trapped within those layers is a record of the air itself, the temperature, the dust, the chemistry of a world that existed long before anyone thought to write anything down. Somewhere within these ice cores, at a depth corresponding to roughly 74,000 years before the present, researchers found something unusual. A thin, distinct layer of volcanic ash, so fine it is more accurately described as glass. Microscopic shards of cooled magma, light enough to have travelled enormous distances on high-altitude winds before finally settling and becoming trapped in the accumulating snow. This kind of material is called tephra, and it acts almost like a fingerprint. Every volcanic eruption produces ash with its own distinctive chemical signature, shaped by the particular composition of the magma that produced it. By analysing the exact chemistry of this ancient ash, the ratios of trace elements locked inside those tiny glass shards, scientists were able to trace it back to its source, not to a volcano near Greenland, not to anything in the northern hemisphere at all. The trail led all the way to a single caldera on the island of Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia, more than 9,000 kilometres away. Think about the distance involved. 9,000 kilometres is roughly the distance from London to Beijing, or from New York to Cape Town, and yet ash from a single eruption on that Indonesian island travelled far enough and in high enough quantities to be detected in ice cores drilled from the opposite side of the planet in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. The same distinct ash layer has since been found not just in polar ice, but in ocean sediment cores from the Indian Ocean, in ancient lake beds in Africa, in soil deposits across India and the Arabian Peninsula. Wherever scientists have looked for it, in the right layer of the right kind of deposit, it tends to be there. This is the signature of an eruption on a scale that is almost impossible to compare to anything in recorded human experience. The volcano responsible, known today as Toba, did not simply erupt the way we usually picture a volcano erupting, a plume of smoke, a river of lava, a dramatic but geographically contained event. What happened at Toba roughly 74,000 years ago was something categorized by volcanologists as a super-eruption, one of the largest such events identified anywhere in the geological record of the last several million years. The numbers involved are almost too large to hold comfortably in the mind, Estimates suggest the eruption ejected somewhere in the range of 2,800 cubic kilometers of material, ash, pumice, and volcanic gas, into the atmosphere. For comparison, the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo, itself a major eruption that measurably cooled the global climate for a couple of years, released roughly 10 cubic kilometers of material. Toba's eruption was, by volume, hundreds of times larger. What remains today where the volcano once stood is Lake Toba, a body of water so large it is sometimes mistaken, at first glance on a map, for an inland sea. It stretches roughly 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide, filling the caldera left behind after the eruption emptied the magma chamber beneath the volcano and the ground above it collapsed inward. An island sits in the middle of the lake today, itself larger than some small countries, formed by the slow uplift of the caldera floor in the millennia since the eruption. It is, in its quiet, scenic present-day form, one of the more striking reminders on Earth of just how much can change, and how quickly, when the ground itself gives way. During the eruption itself, the immediate effects would have been almost unimaginable to anyone within 1,000 kilometers or more. Pyroclastic flows, superheated clouds of gas and ash moving faster than a car on a highway, would have swept outward across Sumatra and likely reached neighbouring land masses, sterilising everything in their path. Ashfall would have blanketed the region for thousands of kilometres in every direction, in some places burying the ground under layers thick enough to collapse roofs and choke rivers. In India, more than 2,500 kilometres from the eruption site, ash deposits attributed to Toba have been found in some places several metres thick, not a light dusting, but a genuine burial of the landscape under volcanic debris. Anyone living across that vast swath of South and Southeast Asia at the time would have experienced something that, from a human perspective, must have felt indistinguishable from the end of the world. Days, possibly weeks, of darkened skies. Ash falling instead of rain. Water sources contaminated. Plants coated and dying. Air that was difficult in the worst affected areas to breathe at all. But it is what happened afterward, in the months and years following the immediate eruption, that connects most directly to the mystery of the human population bottleneck. A super-eruption on this scale does not simply affect the region immediately around it. The sheer volume of fine ash and, more significantly, sulfur dioxide gas thrown high into the stratosphere spreads on global wind patterns, circling the entire planet within weeks and lingering there for years. Once in the stratosphere, sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapour to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, forming a fine, high-altitude aerosol haze that can persist for years before it eventually settles back to Earth. That haze reflects a portion of incoming sunlight back into space before it ever reaches the ground, producing an effect that volcanologists call a volcanic winter. Smaller eruptions have produced measurable, if modest, global cooling in modern times. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 lowered average global temperatures by a small but detectable fraction of a degree for roughly a year. Toba, by some estimates, may have injected enough sulfate aerosol into the stratosphere to lower average global temperatures by several degrees, possibly as much as 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, sustained for a period that some researchers argue may have lasted years, and which, combined with the broader climatic instability of this glacial period, may have contributed to colder conditions persisting for a decade or more afterward. It is worth pausing here to say plainly that this exact figure, and the length of time the cooling lasted, remains genuinely debated among scientists. Ice core and climate modelling studies have produced a range of estimates, some suggesting a shorter and less severe cooling event than early researchers proposed, others supporting a more prolonged and dramatic one. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is simply an honest reflection of how difficult it is to reconstruct, with total confidence, the exact atmospheric conditions of a single decade that occurred 74,000 years ago. What is not seriously disputed is that the eruption happened, that it was extraordinarily large, and that it occurred at almost exactly the same point in time that the genetic evidence suggests our species was passing through its narrowest population bottleneck. There is something worth understanding about what a stratospheric sulfate haze of this kind actually does to a landscape, beyond the simple fact of cooling, because the mechanism has effects that ripple outward in ways that are easy to overlook at first glance. Reduced sunlight does not only lower temperatures, it also reduces the rate of photosynthesis in plants across the affected regions, slowing growth in exactly the kinds of wild grains, tubers and fruiting plants that foraging populations depended upon. A cooler, dim a few years, is not simply a matter of needing warmer clothing. It is a matter of the entire base of the food web slowing down at once, with consequences that move upward through every link in that chain, from plants to the herbivores that eat them, to the humans and other predators who in turn depended on those herbivores. Rainfall patterns, too, are sensitive to exactly this kind of atmospheric disruption. A significant reduction in the temperature difference between the equator and the poles, one of the effects a severe volcanic winter can produce, can weaken the atmospheric circulation patterns responsible for driving monsoon rains toward the regions that depend on them most heavily. Some climate models simulating the aftermath of an eruption on Toba's scale suggest exactly this kind of monsoon disruption may have occurred, layering an additional strain of reduced rainfall on top of the direct effects of cooling and reduced sunlight, compounding the difficulty for populations already dependent on predictable seasonal rains for their survival. None of these effects would have needed to be permanent to be devastating. A single, severely disrupted growing season, arriving after a population had already built its numbers up to whatever level the local environment could ordinarily support, can be enough to trigger real hardship, particularly for a species like ours that, unlike many other mammals, tends to raise relatively few offspring at a time, investing heavily in each one across a long period of dependent childhood. A population that loses even a single generation's worth of successful births, or that loses a disproportionate number of its youngest and oldest members during a few genuinely difficult years, can take a very long time, measured in generations rather than seasons, to recover its previous numbers even after the immediate environmental crisis itself has fully passed. The world these clouds settled over was already a difficult one. The eruption did not happen during a warm, stable interglacial period with abundant resources to spare. It happened during the last glacial period, a long, cold stretch of Earth's climatic history when ice sheets already covered much of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were already lower than today, and many regions that support agriculture and dense human populations now were colder, drier, and far less forgiving. A sudden sharp bout of additional cooling, layered on top of conditions that were already challenging, would have pushed an already strained world closer still to its limits. Picture what this might have meant for the small bands of humans living across Africa and beyond during this window. Reduced sunlight reaching the ground would have slowed plant growth across enormous areas. Cooler temperatures would have shortened growing seasons and shifted the ranges of the animals that people depended on for food. Rainfall patterns, already sensitive to small shifts in global temperature, could have been disrupted in ways that made already marginal environments even less reliable. None of this needs to have been a single dramatic catastrophe experienced in a single terrible week. It could just as easily have unfolded as several difficult years, stacked one on top of another, each one a little harder than the one before, wearing down small, isolated populations that had little margin left to lose. There is a phrase some researchers use for this kind of scenario, one worth sitting with quietly for a moment. A volcanic winter is rarely what kills people outright. What it does is remove the buffer. It takes populations that were already living close to the edge of what their environment could support, and it pushes them past that edge, not all at once, but slowly over a period of years, until the ordinary business of survival simply becomes too difficult to sustain at the numbers that existed before. This is the theory at its simplest. A single, colossal volcanic eruption on the far side of the world, so large it left its fingerprint in ice at both poles, may have triggered a period of sudden global cooling severe enough to strain human populations everywhere, pushing an already thinly spread species down toward the narrow, fragile numbers the genetic evidence describes. It is an elegant theory, in the way that the best scientific explanations often are. A single cause, a single moment in deep time, connecting evidence from ice at the poles, ash in ocean sediment, and DNA carried inside every living human being, all converging on the same narrow window of the past. And for a while, after it was first proposed in the late 1990s, this explanation gained wide traction, offering a satisfying, almost cinematic answer to a mystery that had, until then, remained frustratingly abstract. But mysteries this old rarely stay simple for long. In the years since, as researchers have gathered more evidence, from archaeological sites, from more detailed ice cores, from closer study of the climate models themselves, the picture has become considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting, because it turns out that some of the very same coastal sites where our ancestors show the clearest evidence of survival and even flourishing, sites like the ones with the shell middens and the heat-treated stone tools, appear to show remarkably little disruption in exactly the years immediately following the Toba eruption. It is worth pausing to trace how scientists first came to connect this distant eruption to the human population bottleneck at all, because the story of the discovery is, in its own way, almost as interesting as the discovery itself. The Toba caldera had been known to geologists for a long time before anyone thought to connect it directly to human evolutionary history. Its sheer size made it an object of scientific curiosity in its own right, long before genetic studies of ancient population bottlenecks had even become possible. Early geological surveys in the region, dating back over a century, had already noted the unusual scale of the caldera and speculated about the eruption that must have produced it. It was only later, as radiometric dating techniques improved and researchers were able to pin down the age of the eruption with increasing precision, that the timing began to draw attention. Argon-argon dating of volcanic material from the Toba region placed the eruption at close to 74,000 years before the present, with a margin of error of only a few thousand years either way, a remarkably tight window for an event this ancient. At almost exactly the same time, geneticists working independently, using entirely different methods, were arriving at estimates for the human population bottleneck that clustered in this same general range. It was an anthropologist named Stanley Ambrose who, in the late 1990s, first proposed drawing these two independent lines of evidence together into a single, unified theory, arguing that the timing was too close to be coincidental, and that a super-eruption of this scale could plausibly have triggered the kind of severe sustained global cooling capable of pushing an already vulnerable human population toward the very edge of extinction. The theory, sometimes referred to since as the Toba catastrophe theory, offered an elegant, almost irresistible narrative. A single mountain, a single week of eruption, an entire species pushed to the brink and somehow, narrowly, pulled back from it. The theory captured public imagination quickly, in part because it offered something rare in the study of deep prehistory, a specific, dramatic, nameable cause for an otherwise abstract and difficult to visualize genetic pattern. It is far easier to picture a mountain exploding than to picture the slow, statistical logic of an effective population size calculation. And there is something undeniably compelling, even now, in the image of a single ancient volcano nearly ending an entire species before that species had even begun to leave any lasting mark on the world. But science, especially science dealing with events this deep in the past, rarely stays satisfied with elegant simplicity for very long, and it should not. In the years following Ambrose's original proposal, other researchers began testing the theory against additional evidence, refining the climate models, searching for more archaeological sites where the ash layer itself could be directly identified and studied. Some of that additional evidence supported the theory. Some of it, as we have already begun to see, complicated it considerably. One of the more interesting refinements came from researchers studying the ash layer's chemistry in even finer detail, attempting to reconstruct exactly how much sulfur dioxide the eruption actually released into the stratosphere, since sulfur dioxide, more than the ash itself, is the primary driver of any resulting climatic cooling. These studies found that the sulfur content of the Toba eruption, while genuinely enormous by any ordinary standard, may have been somewhat lower relative to the sheer volume of ejected material than some of the earliest, most dramatic climate models had assumed, suggesting the resulting cooling, while still very real and very significant, may not have been quite as catastrophic or as long-lasting as the most extreme early estimates proposed. This kind of gradual scientific refinement, correcting and narrowing an initial dramatic claim without discarding it entirely, is exactly how good science is supposed to work, even if it can feel, from the outside, like the mystery keeps sliding just out of reach every time it seems close to being solved. The truth, as best anyone can currently reconstruct it, likely sits somewhere between the most dramatic version of the Toba catastrophe theory and its complete dismissal. The eruption was real and genuinely enormous, and almost certainly did produce meaningful, measurable global cooling for at least a few years afterward. Whether that cooling alone was severe enough to explain the entire population bottleneck on its own, or whether it was one significant factor among several, remains the heart of the ongoing scientific conversation. Which raises a question worth carrying gently forward with us, unresolved for now, into the next layer of this story. If the eruption really was severe enough to threaten our entire species with extinction, why do some of the people living closest to its likely effects seem, in the archaeological record, to have simply carried on? In the early 2000s, a team of researchers working at one of those same coastal sites in South Africa, a rock shelter called Pinnacle Point, made a discovery that quietly unsettled the tidy version of the Toba story that had taken hold in the public imagination. They were not looking for volcanic ash. They were excavating carefully through the layered sediment of the cave floor, the way archaeologists always do, cataloguing stone tools, shell remains, and traces of ancient hearths, working their way down through time one careful layer at a time, and somewhere in that sequence, at a depth that corresponded, based on other dating methods, to almost exactly the moment of the Toba eruption, they found it. A thin band of microscopic volcanic glass shards, chemically matched to the same eruption whose ash had already been found in ice at both poles. This, on its own, was a remarkable find. It meant researchers could now look directly at the archaeological layers immediately above and below the eruption itself, at one of the very sites where our ancestors are known to have been living during this exact window of time, and ask a very specific question. Did life here change in any visible way after the ash fell? The answer, when it came, was not what many expected. The stone tools continued in essentially the same styles and technologies before and after the ash layer. The shell middens continued to accumulate at broadly similar rates. There was no dramatic break in occupation, no sudden gap in the sequence suggesting the site had been abandoned in crisis, no obvious sign of the kind of catastrophic disruption you might expect if the population living there had been pushed to the very edge of survival by a sudden and severe climatic collapse. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I always read the comments, and it's fascinating to see people from all over the world. Anyway, back to the mystery. For a mystery that had seemed, for a while, almost neatly solved, one volcano, one winter, one narrow surviving population, this was an unsettling wrinkle. If the people living along this particular stretch of coast weathered the eruption and its aftermath with so little visible disruption, what does that tell us about the severity of the crisis elsewhere? Was the cooling less catastrophic in this specific region than the model suggested? Or does it suggest something stranger? That the relationship between the eruption and the population bottleneck may not be as simple or as direct as the original theory proposed? The uncertainty deepens further when you look closely at the climate science itself. Researchers running detailed climate models, attempting to simulate exactly how much cooling an eruption of Toba's scale would actually produce, have arrived at a fairly wide range of possible answers depending on the assumptions built into each model. Some simulations suggest a severe, multi-year cooling event consistent with the more dramatic early estimates. Others suggest a more moderate, shorter-lived effect, one that, while still significant, may not have been catastrophic enough on its own to explain a population collapse on the scale the genetic evidence describes. There is also a quieter, more technical complication buried in the ice core evidence itself, one that takes a bit of patience to properly appreciate. Finding a layer of volcanic ash in an ice core tells you that ash fell there, at some point. It does not, on its own, tell you precisely how severe the climatic consequences were on the ground, thousands of kilometers away, in the specific regions where humans happen to be living. The ash is a marker of the eruption's reach. It is not by itself a direct thermometer reading of exactly how cold those particular years became in southern Africa, or how disrupted the local food supply actually was for the people gathering shellfish along that coast. This is the strange and slightly unsettling texture of the mystery once you look closely enough. The pieces line up almost too perfectly to be pure coincidence. The timing of the eruption, the timing of the genetic bottleneck, both clustering in the same narrow window of deep time, and yet the closer researchers look at the specific local evidence of how people were actually living during and immediately after the eruption, the less certain that neat single-cause story becomes. Some archaeologists and geneticists have proposed a more layered explanation, one that does not require throwing out the Toba eruption entirely, but does not lean on it as the sole cause either. In this view, the population bottleneck may have been driven less by any single event, however large, and more by a longer, slower squeeze. A combination of factors playing out across many thousands of years, of which the Toba eruption may have been one significant sharp shock among several, rather than the singular cause of everything. Consider what else was happening in this stretch of deep time, independent of any volcano. The period between roughly 100,000 and 50,000 years ago sits within what climatologists call marine isotope stage 4, and the tail end of marine isotope stage 5, a stretch of the last glacial period marked by its own significant climatic instability, quite apart from any single eruption. Ice sheets were expanding across the northern hemisphere. Global sea levels were dropping as more of the planet's water became locked into glacial ice. Rainfall patterns across Africa, reconstructed from ancient lake sediment cores and cave mineral deposits, show evidence of increasing aridity in many regions during roughly this same broad window, quite apart from any volcanic influence. In other words, the world our ancestors were navigating during this period may have already been growing colder, drier, and more unpredictable on its own, driven by the ordinary grinding rhythms of Earth's long-term climate cycles, the same slow, orbital and atmospheric patterns that have driven the advance and retreat of ice ages across hundreds of thousands of years. If that underlying trend was already placing real pressure on human populations, a sudden and severe volcanic shock, arriving in the middle of an already difficult stretch, could have acted less like the single cause of the crisis and more like the final, sharp blow landing on a population already weakened and thin. There is something almost more unsettling about this layered version of the story than the simpler, single volcano version that came before it. A single dramatic event, however catastrophic, has a kind of clean, comprehensible shape to it. A beginning, an end, a clear cause and a clear consequence. A slow, grinding, multi-causal decline, unfolding across many thousands of years, with no single moment anyone could point to and say, "Here, this is when it happened." That is a harder story to hold, and in some ways a more honest reflection of how difficult it likely was to actually live through, generation after generation, without ever fully understanding what was happening or why. There is a further piece of the puzzle worth considering here, one that comes from thinking carefully about population density rather than population size alone. Even if the total number of surviving humans worldwide fell to only a few thousand, those people were almost certainly not evenly distributed across the planet's surface. They would have been concentrated disproportionately in exactly the kind of resource-rich refuge environments that could reliably support human life even under difficult climatic conditions. Coastlines with dependable shellfish resources, river deltas with year-round water access, a small number of particularly favourable inland regions where local geography happened to buffer against the worst of the broader continental drying. This means the population bottleneck may be better pictured not as a uniform thinning spread evenly across the entire African continent, but as a dramatic contraction into a small number of scattered favourable refugees, surrounded by vast stretches of land that had become, for this period at least, effectively uninhabitable, or at best only marginally habitable. Some researchers have used the term refugium, borrowed from the broader study of how species survive difficult climatic periods, to describe exactly this kind of pattern. Small, favourable pockets of habitat that preserve a population through a period of broader environmental crisis, from which that population can later expand back outward once conditions ease. If this refugium model is broadly correct, it would help explain why the archaeological evidence looks so different from place to place across this same general period. The people at Pinnacle Point were not simply lucky individuals scattered randomly across an otherwise empty landscape. They may have been living in one of a genuinely small number of places on the entire continent, where survival remained consistently possible throughout this difficult stretch, while the vast majority of the wider landscape around them, previously home to other bands and other communities, gradually emptied out entirely as conditions there became too difficult to sustain. It also means the people at Pinnacle Point, and at the other coastal sites like it, may not have been simply lucky bystanders who happened to escape a catastrophe that struck everyone else. They may represent something more specific and more remarkable, one of a small handful of environments on the entire planet resilient enough, in exactly the right ways, to absorb both the slow grinding pressure of a cooling, drying world and the sharper shock of a singular volcanic winter without buckling entirely. Places where the tides kept coming in and out regardless of what the sky was doing, where shellfish, unlike inland game or seasonal plants, remained available through hard years in a way that few other food sources could match. If that is closer to the truth, then the story of this bottleneck is not really the story of a single mountain and a single winter at all. It is the story of a species being tested from multiple directions at once, over a long and difficult stretch of deep time, and surviving not because of any single stroke of luck, but because a handful of small, scattered populations in a handful of specific and fortunate environments found ways to keep the thin thread of human continuity from snapping entirely. There is a further complication worth sitting with, one that comes from looking beyond southern Africa entirely, toward the regions closest to the eruption itself. If the coastal populations of southern Africa show surprisingly little disruption in the archaeological record, what do we find at sites much closer to Sumatra in South Asia, where the ashfall was heaviest and most direct, and where any climatic effects should, in principle, have been felt most severely and most immediately? Here the evidence becomes genuinely fascinating and genuinely contested. At a site called Jwalapuram in southern India, researchers have found stone tools in sediment layers both immediately above and immediately below a thick deposit of toba ash, in some places several meters deep, representing one of the most direct and dramatic physical encounters between an ancient human population and this eruption anywhere in the archaeological record. Remarkably, the stone tool technologies found above and below this thick ash layer appear broadly similar in style, suggesting, at least to the researchers who excavated the site, a degree of technological and cultural continuity across the eruption, rather than a sharp catastrophic break. This finding proved genuinely controversial when it was first published, precisely because it seemed to run directly against the most dramatic version of the Toba catastrophe theory. If human populations in South Asia were burying themselves under meters of ash, and yet continuing to produce broadly similar stone tools immediately afterward, does that suggest the eruption's impact on human survival was less severe than originally proposed, even in the region closest to the volcano itself? Some researchers have argued exactly this. Others have pushed back, noting that stone tool style alone is a limited proxy for population health and continuity, and that a population could easily have been severely reduced in number, even to a small fraction of its previous size, while the small number of survivors who remained continued making tools in broadly the same traditional style they had always known, simply because that was the only toolmaking knowledge available to them, regardless of how few people remained to practice it. This distinction between cultural continuity and demographic continuity turns out to matter enormously, and it is one of the trickier conceptual knots at the centre of this entire mystery. A population can survive an eruption of this scale, in the sense that the surviving individuals continue their cultural traditions in recognisable form, while also having suffered a catastrophic reduction in their actual numbers. The stone tools cannot by themselves tell us how many hands were shaping them, only what shapes those hands, however few, continued to produce. Genetic evidence from populations in India and surrounding regions offers some additional, if still incomplete, insight here. Studies of genetic diversity among South Asian populations have looked for evidence of a population bottleneck specifically associated with the Toba eruption, given how directly this region would have been affected by the ashfall and any resulting climatic disruption. The results have been mixed and are still actively debated among researchers, with some studies finding signals consistent with a significant population reduction in this specific region around this specific time, and others finding the genetic signal too ambiguous, given the complexities of later population movements and mixing across this region, to draw firm conclusions either way. What emerges from all of this taken together is a mystery considerably more textured than its earliest, simplest telling. Not a single global catastrophe experienced identically everywhere on Earth, but a patchwork of different regional experiences shaped by local geography, local climate, local access to resilient food sources like the shellfish along the southern African coast, and quite possibly by simple, unrecoverable chance. Some populations in some places may have been devastated. Others, in other places favourably positioned by geography or by accumulated cultural knowledge, may have weathered the same broad period of global stress with far less disruption. That is a heavier, slower kind of mystery than the one we started with, but it may also be a truer one, and it leads us gently toward a different kind of question than the one we began with. Not only what happened to the climate, or what happened to the population numbers, but who specifically these last remaining people actually were, what their daily lives looked like, what it might have meant in practice to be one of only a few thousand people left carrying an entire species forward into an uncertain future. It helps, at this point in the story, to slow down and simply imagine a single evening. Not a reconstruction of an entire era, not a sweep across continents, just one evening, in one cave, along that southern coastline, somewhere in the long stretch of years when the human population of the entire Earth may have numbered only in the low thousands. The light outside is fading toward that particular shade of blue that comes just after sunset, when the sky still holds a little brightness, but the sea has already gone dark. Inside the cave mouth, a fire is being built up for the night, not a large one, just enough to hold back the chill and keep away anything that might wander too close in the dark. Smoke drifts up along the cave's ceiling and out through a gap in the rock, following a path worn smooth by generations of the same small habit, repeated night after night for longer than anyone in the group could say. There are perhaps 25 or 30 people here tonight, not a village, not even, by later standards, a proper settlement, a band, grandparents who remember stories told to them by their own grandparents, stories about places further inland that their family no longer visits, because the game there has grown too scarce and unpredictable to rely on. Parents, still strong enough to gather and hunt and carry. Children, running the narrow, worn paths between the cave and the tide pools below with the easy, unthinking confidence of people who have never known any other kind of life. Someone is working a piece of stone by the firelight, striking careful, practiced blows to shape an edge, following a pattern of technique that has been refined and passed down through more generations than anyone present could count. Someone else is separating shellfish from a woven bundle gathered earlier that day, sorting them by size, setting some aside to be eaten tonight and others to be preserved. A child leans against an older relative's side, half asleep already, listening without really following to a low conversation about which stretch of the tide pools to visit tomorrow, depending on the moon. This is what survival actually looked like in the vast majority of its hours. Not a dramatic struggle against overwhelming odds, though those moments certainly came, in bad seasons, in hard years, in the kind of crisis that leaves no trace beyond a slightly thinner layer of shell in the archaeological record decades later. Mostly survival looked like this: ordinary evenings, small tasks repeated with care, children falling asleep to the sound of adults talking quietly near a fire. It is easy, when discussing something as vast and abstract as a population bottleneck, to lose sight of the fact that every single number in that story represents actual people, with actual daily lives, actual relationships, actual small joys and worries that had nothing directly to do with the survival of an entire species and everything to do with getting through one particular day and then the next. The archaeological evidence, patient and careful as it is, occasionally offers small windows into exactly this kind of intimate detail. At Blombos Cave, another of the key coastal sites from this period, researchers uncovered a small abalone shell that had clearly been used at some point in the deep past as a container. Traces inside it, when analysed, revealed a mixture of ochre, crushed bone, charcoal, and a binding agent, likely some kind of fat, all combined together into a compound that appears to have been deliberately prepared as a kind of paint or pigment. Beside the shell, researchers found the simple tools that appear to have been used in its preparation: a grinding stone, a small hammer stone, all of it left together as though someone had finished their work, set everything down carefully in its place, and simply walked away, never to return and gather these particular tools again. The whole assemblage had been sealed, undisturbed, beneath layers of sediment for roughly 100,000 years, a length of time so vast it is difficult to hold in the mind at all, and yet the arrangement itself feels almost startlingly ordinary. A workspace, a set of materials prepared and ready, waiting for someone who simply never came back to use them. There is no way to know now who that person was, whether they were a man or a woman, elderly or young, whether they mixed that pigment for their own skin, or to mark a tool, or as part of some ritual or ceremony connected to belief systems that left no other trace we can decode. We can know only that they existed, that they took real care in their work, gathering the right materials, grinding them to the right consistency, preparing something that mattered enough to be made properly. And then, for reasons entirely lost to us, that particular thread of their story simply stops. There is a particular find from this same cave that deserves special attention on its own, because it speaks so directly to something beyond mere subsistence. Alongside the ochre workshop, researchers at Blombos also uncovered a small, flat piece of ochre bearing a deliberately engraved pattern of cross-hatched lines, dated to roughly 73,000 years before the present, placing it almost exactly within the window of the population bottleneck itself. The pattern is not random. It is composed of a series of parallel diagonal lines crossed by another series running in the opposite direction, forming a careful, repeated lattice across the stone surface, made, as far as researchers can determine, through careful microscopic analysis of the individual cut marks, with a single sharpened point in a single continuous session of deliberate work. Similar engraved patterns have since been found on other pieces of ochre and even on pieces of ostrich eggshell from related sites in the same broader region, suggesting this was not an isolated singular act by one unusually inventive individual, but part of a broader, shared cultural practice, understood and repeated across a community, and in some cases across considerable spans of time and distance. Whatever these patterns meant to the people who made them, whether decorative, symbolic, mnemonic, or something else entirely that does not map neatly onto any of our own modern categories, they represent a form of behaviour researchers describe as evidence of symbolic thought, the capacity to invest an object with meaning that exists beyond its immediate practical function. This kind of evidence, small and specific and strangely moving, is part of what makes this period of deep history feel less like an abstract scientific puzzle and more like something genuinely human, in the fullest sense of that word. These were not simple, undeveloped ancestors, dimly stumbling through survival on pure instinct. The people living through this bottleneck were, in every meaningful sense, exactly like us. They noticed beauty. They prepared things with care, even things with no obvious practical use. They almost certainly told each other stories, though none of those stories survive in any form we can access now. They loved their children, in whatever particular shape that love took in their culture and their time, and worried over them, and grieved when they were lost. What set their lives apart from ours was not any deficiency in their inner world, but the sheer scale and fragility of the world they were living in. A world with, at most, a few thousand other people scattered across it. A world in which an entire branch of the human family, an entire community, an entire set of relationships, an entire accumulated store of shared knowledge and memory, could simply end, quietly, without record, if a single hard season proved too much for a single small band to survive. It is worth pausing to imagine, too, what contact between different bands might have looked like during this period, because it likely mattered more than almost anything else. Small, isolated populations face a particular kind of risk beyond simple starvation or exposure, genetic risk. When a group becomes too small and too isolated, breeding only among its own limited numbers across multiple generations, the accumulated effects of that isolation can themselves become dangerous, reducing the genetic diversity available to help a population weather disease, adapt to changing conditions, and avoid the compounding effects of shared, inherited vulnerabilities. This means that survival, during this period, likely depended not only on any single band's skill at gathering food or maintaining fire, but on their ability to maintain connections with other bands, however distant, to meet, occasionally, at agreed places and times, to exchange partners for marriage, to trade stories and technologies, and perhaps small quantities of valued materials like ochre or particular kinds of stone not available locally. These meetings, rare and precious as they likely were in a world with so few people scattered across such enormous distances, may have been one of the quiet, essential threads holding the entire fragile network of human survival together. Archaeologists studying the stone tool technologies from sites across this region and this period have found evidence that supports exactly this kind of ongoing contact. Certain distinctive styles of toolmaking, certain particular techniques, appear at multiple different sites across considerable distances, suggesting that knowledge, and likely people, were moving between these small coastal populations, even during the hardest years. The stone did not travel on its own. Someone carried it, or carried the knowledge of how to make it, from one small fire to another, across distances that, on foot, in a difficult climate, would have taken real courage and real determination to cross. There is something quietly remarkable in the thought of it. In the very same centuries when the human species as a whole was passing through its narrowest and most fragile moment, individual people were still making the deliberate choice to walk toward each other, rather than simply retreating into isolated survival, still choosing, in whatever version of that word existed for them, connection over pure self-preservation. It is tempting, and perhaps not unreasonable, to think that this instinct, the pull toward gathering, toward sharing, toward maintaining bonds across distance and difficulty, may have been every bit as important to our species' survival during this period as any particular technology or food source. We are, after all, still here, still gathering, still sharing stories across distances that would have seemed impossible to imagine to anyone sitting by a fire in one of those coastal caves. In a strange and quiet way, the fact that you are listening to this story right now, wherever you happen to be in the world tonight, is itself a small continuation of exactly that same ancient instinct, a voice, reaching across distance towards someone else, simply because the reaching itself matters. It is worth thinking, too, about what the ordinary rhythms of a life like this actually would have entailed across the full arc of a person's years, not simply as a single evening scene, but as a full lifetime lived inside a population this small. Life expectancy for a person who survived early childhood during this period, based on comparative studies of forager populations both ancient and more recent, may have reached into the 50s or even 60s in reasonably good conditions, though infant and early childhood mortality was almost certainly high, meaning average life expectancy at birth, pulled down heavily by these early losses, would have looked considerably lower. This matters for understanding the texture of daily life in a band this size. A group of 25 or 30 people, drawn from across several generations, would likely have included only a handful of women of childbearing age at any given time, and only a smaller handful of children who survived past their most vulnerable early years. Every single successful birth, every child who lived long enough to grow into an adult, capable of learning and eventually passing on the accumulated knowledge of the group mattered enormously, not only emotionally, in whatever form that emotional weight took within their particular culture, but in the most literal, practical sense of the group's continued existence. Elders in a context like this would have carried a particular kind of importance that is sometimes easy to underestimate from a modern vantage point, built around written records and archived knowledge. In a population with no writing, with no external repository of information beyond human memory itself, an elder who had lived through 40 or 50 years of tides, seasons, droughts, and hard winters represented something close to a living library. Knowledge of exactly which tide pools remained productive during unusually dry years, memory of which plants, growing in which specific locations, could be relied upon even when more common food sources failed, awareness of distant bands, met perhaps only once or twice in a lifetime, but remembered well enough to know where to seek help if a particular crisis grew severe enough to require it. The loss of a single elder, in a population this small and this dependent on orally transmitted knowledge, could represent a genuine and sometimes irrecoverable loss of accumulated wisdom, not merely a personal grief, though it would certainly have been that as well. This may be part of why so much of the archaeological evidence from these coastal sites suggests careful, sustained, multi-generational continuity of technique and practice, the heat treating of stone, the reading of tides, the specific methods of processing ochre. These were not casual habits, easily reinvented if lost. They were precious, carefully guarded inheritances, and the people holding them would very likely have understood, in whatever way their culture expressed such understanding, just how much depended on passing them along intact. There is a particular kind of attentiveness that a life like this would have demanded, a level of environmental awareness that is difficult for anyone living in a modern, resource-abundant world to fully appreciate. Every plant in the surrounding landscape would have needed to be known, not abstractly but specifically. Which ones were edible during which season? Which ones looked similar to a dangerous relative and had to be carefully distinguished? Which ones, beyond providing food, could be used for medicine, for binding, for building? The tide itself would have needed to be read with a precision closer to what we might now associate with a skilled meteorologist than with casual observation, understanding not just the simple daily rhythm of high and low tide, but the more complex monthly and seasonal variations that determined exactly when the richest gathering would be possible. This deep, textured knowledge of a specific place, held collectively across a small population and passed down with real care from one generation to the next, may itself have been one of the most important, if least visible, survival technologies our ancestors possessed during this period. It cannot be excavated directly, the way a stone tool or a shell midden can be. It leaves no direct physical trace of its own, but its effects are everywhere in the archaeological record. Visible in the consistency and sophistication of the resource used these sites display, generation after generation, across a period when the wider world beyond these small coastal refuges was growing steadily less forgiving. But even with all of this, the coastal knowledge, the maintained connections, the accumulated skill and quiet resilience, the central mystery of this period remains only partly answered. We know, roughly, when the bottleneck occurred. We have strong candidate explanations for at least part of what may have caused it. We have a rich and moving picture of how at least some of the surviving populations managed their daily lives during this period. What we still have not fully answered is the deeper question underneath all of it. What specifically was the nature of the threat our ancestors were actually facing, moment to moment, that pushed the entire species this close to the edge? There is a particular kind of danger that is much harder to survive than a single sudden catastrophe, and it may be the truest answer to what our ancestors were actually facing during this period. It is not a monster, not an enemy, not even, strictly speaking, a single event. It is smallness itself, the quiet, compounding danger of simply being too few. When a population is large, it can absorb almost anything. A bad harvest in one region is offset by a good one somewhere else. A disease that sweeps through one community leaves others, geographically distant or genetically different enough to resist it, untouched. A hard winter kills the old and the very young in disproportionate numbers, but the overall population, numbering in the millions or hundreds of thousands, barely notices the dent a generation later. None of that is available to a population of a few thousand. There is no elsewhere to draw on. There is no distant, unaffected community to send help, or seed, or new genetic diversity, because there may not be any other community within reach at all, or those that do exist may be facing the exact same pressures at the exact same time. Every hardship lands with its full weight, undiluted, on a group of people who have nowhere else to turn. This is, in the end, likely closer to the real shape of the crisis our ancestors faced than any single dramatic event, however large. Not one catastrophe, but a world that had become, gradually and then more sharply, a place where the ordinary margin of safety that a larger population enjoys simply no longer existed. A colder, drier climate reduced the reliability of food sources across much of the African interior. A single, enormous volcanic eruption, whatever its exact severity, added a sharp shock on top of an already difficult situation, at least in some regions for at least some period of time. And beneath both of those pressures sat the deeper, quieter danger of small numbers themselves. The fact that once a population falls low enough, the ordinary bad luck of life, the kind every generation faces in some form, becomes disproportionately dangerous because there are so few people left to absorb it. Researchers who study population dynamics in endangered species today, ironically, have learned a great deal that applies directly to this ancient human story, simply by watching what happens to modern animal populations that fall to critically low numbers. Below a certain threshold, a population enters what conservation biologists sometimes call an extinction vortex, a self-reinforcing spiral in which small numbers lead to reduced genetic diversity, which leads to reduced resilience against disease and environmental change, which leads to further population decline, which further reduces genetic diversity, and so on, each factor making the next one worse. Populations can sometimes escape this spiral if conditions improve enough, quickly enough, and if enough individuals remain to rebuild both numbers and diversity. But the lower a population falls, the narrower that window of possible escape becomes, and the more precarious the whole situation. There is a useful, if humbling, comparison available from the study of modern endangered species that have actually passed through bottlenecks this severe and survived them, since a small number of cases have been documented closely enough by conservation biologists to offer real insight. The northern elephant seal, for instance, was hunted so intensively during the 19th century that its population fell, by some estimates, to as few as 20 individuals before hunting finally stopped and legal protections allowed the population to begin recovering. Today, northern elephant seals number in the hundreds of thousands, a recovery so dramatic it is often cited as a conservation success story. And yet genetic studies of the modern population reveal strikingly low genetic diversity, a lasting, measurable echo of that narrow founding population from barely more than a century ago, a bottleneck considerably more recent, and by some measures considerably more severe, than the one our own ancestors passed through. This comparison offers a strange kind of reassurance and a strange kind of caution, both at once. It confirms that a population can indeed recover dramatically in numbers even after falling to an extraordinarily narrow base, provided the underlying pressures causing the decline eventually ease. But it also confirms that the genetic narrowness such an event produces does not simply disappear once numbers recover. It persists, sometimes for many generations, sometimes indefinitely, a quiet structural vulnerability carried forward by every descendant of that narrow founding population, whether they are elephant seals or, as the evidence increasingly suggests, human beings. It is genuinely difficult to know, with the evidence currently available, exactly how close our species came to falling into a spiral of this kind without ever climbing back out. The fact that we are here, telling this story, having descended in an unbroken line from whichever small band survived this period, means that whatever the true severity of the crisis, it did not tip past the point of no return, but it is worth sitting, gently, with how genuinely uncertain that outcome likely felt, or would have felt, to anyone capable of understanding the full picture at the time, which of course no one living through it could have. There is also the question, quieter and perhaps more uncomfortable, of what role other related groups of ancient humans may have played in shaping the pressures our own ancestors were navigating during this window of time. Homo sapiens was not the only human-like species walking the earth 74,000 years ago. Neanderthals still occupied large parts of Europe and Western Asia. In parts of Asia, other, more mysterious populations, sometimes referred to broadly as Denisovans, based primarily on genetic evidence and a small number of fossil fragments, since so little of their physical remains has ever been recovered, appear to have existed as well, in territories that overlapped, at least in some places, with the outer edges of the regions our own ancestors were expanding into or retreating from during this same difficult period. We know from genetic evidence carried in the DNA of people alive today that interbreeding did occur between these different human populations at various points in deep history. Most people of non-African ancestry today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, a quiet physical inheritance from encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago between two different closely related kinds of humans meeting each other, for reasons and in circumstances we can only partially reconstruct. Some populations, particularly in parts of Asia and Oceania, carry a notable percentage of Denisovan DNA as well. This raises a genuinely fascinating and still largely unresolved question. During the period of our species' greatest fragility, were we in some kind of competition with these other human populations, for territory, for resources, for the same increasingly scarce margins of a difficult cooling world? Or were the relationships more complicated, more occasionally cooperative, involving contact and exchange as well as competition, in ways that varied enormously depending on the specific place and the specific moment? The genetic evidence of interbreeding suggests, at the very least, that the boundaries between these different human populations were not always hostile ones. Somewhere, at some point, people from different lineages met and chose, in whatever way that choice took shape for them, to come together rather than remain entirely apart. It is possible, and some researchers have suggested exactly this, that our species' eventual advantage over these other human populations, all of whom, notably, eventually went extinct themselves, leaving Homo sapiens as the last human lineage standing by roughly 40,000 years ago, may have had less to do with any single dramatic superiority, and more to do with exactly the kinds of quiet, cumulative advantages already discussed, the capacity to maintain wider social networks across greater distances, the ability to exploit a broader range of food sources, including reliable coastal resources unavailable to more inland-adapted populations, a perhaps greater flexibility in adapting behaviour and technology quickly in response to changing conditions. None of this offers a single, clean answer to the central question of what our ancestors were truly facing during this period, and that in its own way may be the most honest conclusion available. They were facing, all at once and in shifting combinations depending on where exactly they happened to be living, a cooling and drying climate that reduced the reliability of the resources they depended on, the sudden, sharp shock of an unprecedented volcanic eruption whose full severity remains genuinely debated, the compounding, self-reinforcing dangers that come with simply being too few people spread too thin across too wide a world, and, in some regions, complex, still poorly understood relationships with other closely related human populations who were themselves navigating the exact same difficult stretch of deep time. It was, in other words, not a single threat with a single face. It was the accumulated weight of an entire world becoming, slowly and then in places quite sharply, less forgiving than it had been before. And the fact that any human being survived that accumulated weight at all, let alone survived it in numbers eventually sufficient to rebuild an entire global population from which every person alive today descends, is genuinely remarkable when you sit with it for long enough. It is worth widening the picture a little further here, because Homo sapiens was not, during this period, confined entirely to Africa. Evidence from sites across the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, and even further into South and Southeast Asia, suggests that small groups of modern humans had already begun venturing beyond the African continent at various points before this bottleneck period, in what researchers sometimes describe as earlier, smaller, and ultimately less successful dispersals, distinct from the much larger, more sustained wave of expansion that would eventually populate the rest of the world after this bottleneck period had passed. Some of these earlier dispersing groups appear, based on the currently available evidence, to have died out entirely, leaving little or no genetic trace in populations alive today. A set of remains found at a site called School, in what is now Israel, dating to considerably earlier than the bottleneck period discussed here, shows clear anatomical features associated with modern humans, evidence of an early presence outside Africa that, as far as current genetic evidence can determine, did not contribute meaningfully to the ancestry of people alive today. Whatever happened to this particular group, whether they were absorbed into other populations, outcompeted, or simply failed to maintain sufficient numbers across enough generations, their specific genetic lineage appears to represent one of several early attempts at expansion that ultimately did not succeed in the way the later post-bottleneck expansion eventually would. This pattern of repeated early attempts at expansion beyond Africa, some succeeding and most apparently failing or fading out, adds an important layer of context to the central mystery of this period. The population bottleneck we have been describing was not necessarily a single, uniform event experienced identically by a single unified population. It may be better understood as the survival from among several different populations and lineages of modern humans existing at this time of one or a small handful of specific groups whose particular descendants happen to be the ones who eventually expanded successfully enough, sometime after this bottleneck period, to populate the rest of the world and become the ancestors of every person alive today. In other words, the story of near extinction may be, in an important sense, also a story of selection, though not necessarily selection in the sense of any group being inherently superior to another. It may have been, at least in significant part, a matter of which particular populations happen to be living in the right places, with the right accumulated knowledge, at the right moments, to weather the specific combination of pressures this period presented. The coastal populations of southern Africa, with their sophisticated understanding of tidal resources, may represent exactly this kind of fortunate positioning, a lineage that happened, through some combination of accumulated cultural knowledge and simple favourable geography, to be well suited to endure precisely the kind of environmental pressures defining this period, while other, less fortunately positioned populations elsewhere thinned away and eventually disappeared. This reframing matters because it shifts the emotional weight of the story slightly. It is not only a story about how close our entire species came to disappearing, it is also, quietly, a story about the many other human lineages, other bands, other small communities scattered across Africa and beyond during this same period, whose particular threads did not, in the end, continue forward. We do not know their names. We do not know exactly where or how their specific lines ended, but their existence and their eventual disappearance from our shared ancestry is itself part of the honest, full shape of this story, even if it is a part that leaves no direct trace we can point to and examine. From here, the story turns toward the different explanations researchers have proposed for exactly how this crisis unfolded, and exactly what allowed our ancestors to eventually climb back from the edge of it. Each explanation illuminates a different piece of the picture. None of them, on its own, fully closes the mystery. And there is something fitting in that. A story this old, about a period this fragile and this poorly documented, was perhaps never going to end in a single tidy answer. It may be more honest, and in its own way more comforting, to hold several possibilities gently at once, the way the evidence itself seems to require. There is another kind of evidence, drawn from a different part of the world entirely, that offers what many researchers now consider the strongest single natural explanation for the pressures our ancestors faced during this period. It comes not from ice, and not from ash, but from mud. Specifically, from the layered sediment sitting quietly at the bottom of some of Africa's deepest and oldest lakes. Lake Malawi in East Africa is one of the deepest lakes on Earth and one of the oldest, its basin having existed in roughly its current form for well over 1 million years. Because it is so deep and so ancient, sediment has been settling gently onto its floor, layer by undisturbed layer, for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, creating a record every bit as detailed, in its own way, as the ice cores drilled from the polar regions. Each layer of that sediment holds clues, chemical and biological, about the exact conditions of the climate above it at the moment it settled. The presence or absence of certain kinds of pollen, the ratio of particular chemical isotopes, the depth and composition of the mud itself all combine to let researchers reconstruct, with real precision, how full or how empty this lake has been at different points across its long history. When researchers drilled down into these layers and examined the record corresponding to this same broad window of deep time, roughly 100,000 to 70,000 years ago, they found something striking. Evidence of a series of prolonged severe droughts, some so extreme that Lake Malawi, a lake today so large it is sometimes mistaken for an inland sea, appears to have shrunk dramatically during this period, its water level dropping by hundreds of meters at points, exposing vast stretches of its lake bed that would ordinarily lie deep beneath the surface. This is not a small, ordinary fluctuation of the kind lakes experience from year to year, or even decade to decade. This is evidence of climate conditions so dry and sustained for so long that one of the largest and deepest lakes on the entire African continent came close, at points, to nearly emptying. And Lake Malawi was not alone. Similar evidence of severe, sustained megadroughts during roughly this same period has been found in lake sediment records elsewhere in East Africa, and in some cases in southern Africa as well, suggesting that this dry period was not a single, localized event, but a broad pattern affecting large portions of the continent where our ancestors were living at the time. It is worth taking a moment to appreciate how researchers actually extract this level of detail from what is, after all, simply layered mud sitting at the bottom of a lake for tens of thousands of years. The process involves drilling a long, narrow core straight down through the accumulated lakebed sediment, sometimes reaching depths of hundreds of meters, and then examining that core layer by careful layer back in a laboratory. Each thin band of sediment can be dated using a combination of methods, including radiocarbon dating for more recent layers and other radiometric techniques for older material, along with careful correlation to known volcanic ash layers, including, in some cases, ash from the very same Toba eruption discussed earlier, which serves as a convenient, precisely dated marker researchers can use to calibrate the surrounding layers of sediment. Within each layer, researchers examine the ratios of different oxygen isotopes preserved in microscopic fossils and mineral deposits, ratios that shift in predictable, measurable ways depending on how much evaporation the lake was experiencing at the time that particular layer was deposited, which in turn reflects the balance between rainfall and dry season evaporation in the surrounding region. They examine the type and abundance of fossilized pollen preserved in each layer, since different plant communities, adapted to different levels of rainfall, leave behind distinctly different pollen signatures. And they examine the physical composition of the sediment itself, since a shrinking lake leaves behind different kinds of mineral deposits than a full stable one. Layered together, these different lines of evidence allow researchers to reconstruct, with a level of confidence that would have seemed extraordinary only a few decades ago, not just whether a lake was full or empty at a given point in the deep past, but roughly how full, how quickly the level changed, and how long any particular dry or wet period actually lasted. It is a remarkable testament to how much information can be coaxed from material that, to an untrained eye, would look like nothing more than ordinary mud. Consider what a drought of this severity and duration would have meant for anyone depending on the land for food during this period. Rivers that had reliably flowed for generations would have thinned or stopped flowing at certain times of year entirely. Lakes that had supported fish and the animals that came to drink from them, and the plant life around their shores, would have retreated sometimes for miles, leaving behind cracked, exposed lake bed where water had stood for as long as anyone could remember. Grasslands that had supported herds of grazing animals, the kind our ancestors depended on for meat and hide and bone, would have thinned and browned, forcing those herds to migrate elsewhere or simply to shrink in number as their own food sources failed. For inland populations dependent on rivers, lakes and grazing herds, a drought of this severity and duration would have been devastating, potentially far more directly damaging, in practical day-to-day terms, than even a severe volcanic winter occurring elsewhere on the planet. And critically, this evidence of prolonged severe drought does not depend on any single volcanic eruption to explain it. Mega-droughts of this kind are a recurring feature of Earth's long-term climate history, driven by slow, cyclical shifts in the planet's orbit and axial tilt. Shifts that gradually alter how much solar energy different parts of the Earth receive across tens of thousands of years, in turn affecting monsoon patterns, rainfall distribution, and the broader stability of regional climates. This offers what many researchers now consider a more complete, if less singularly dramatic, explanation for the pressures behind the population bottleneck. Rather than a single catastrophic volcanic winter serving as the primary cause, the deeper and more sustained driver may have been this long grinding pattern of mega-drought, unfolding across many thousands of years, driven by the ordinary, if severe, rhythms of Earth's orbital climate cycles, quite independent of any single eruption. The Toba eruption, in this view, may still have played a role, arriving as a sharp, sudden shock layered on top of an already dry and difficult climate trend, potentially tipping already stressed populations over the edge in specific regions and specific years, even if it was not on its own the primary underlying cause of the crisis. This picture also helps explain something that puzzled researchers about the earlier, simpler Toba-centered theory: the apparent resilience of the coastal populations at sites like Pinnacle Point and Blombos. A severe, sustained drought would have devastated the interior of the African continent, where survival depended heavily on rainfall, rivers and grazing herds sensitive to exactly the kind of prolonged dry conditions the lake sediment records describe. But a coastline, particularly one where people had developed the sophisticated knowledge needed to exploit tidal shellfish resources, would have remained comparatively insulated from this specific kind of environmental collapse. Shellfish do not depend on rainfall the way grazing herds and grasslands do. The tide continues coming in and out regardless of how many consecutive dry years a region experiences inland. In this light, the coastal refuges along the southern African shore begin to look less like a lucky accident and more like something closer to a genuine evolutionary and cultural adaptation, developed and refined over a long stretch of difficult, increasingly dry centuries that happened to position a small number of human populations in almost exactly the right kind of environment to weather a crisis that was devastating much of the rest of the continent. Whether by foresight, by accumulated trial and error passed down across many generations, or simply by the fortunate accident of geography, these coastal bands appear to have found themselves living in one of the very few kinds of environments resilient enough to hold steady while a long, dry, difficult stretch of deep time pressed down on almost everywhere else. None of this diminishes the significance of the Toba eruption itself, or the genuine uncertainty that still surrounds its exact climatic impact. It simply reframes it, placing it within a broader and in some ways more sobering context. Our ancestors were not necessarily facing a single sudden catastrophe that struck without warning and then passed. They may have been navigating a long, slow, multi-generational tightening of the world around them, a gradual drying and cooling that made survival progressively harder across many decades and centuries, occasionally punctuated by sharper shocks, whether volcanic or perhaps disease, or perhaps simply an especially severe run of bad seasons in a row, any of which could have pushed an already fragile population closer still to the edge. It is worth understanding a little more about what actually drives a megadrought of this kind, because the mechanism itself is almost as fascinating as its consequences. Earth's climate is shaped, over long stretches of time, by slow, predictable variations in the planet's orbit around the Sun and in the tilt and wobble of its axis, a set of cycles collectively known as Milankovitch cycles, named for the Serbian scientist who first worked out their mathematics in careful detail in the early 20th century. These cycles operate across tens of thousands of years, gradually shifting how much solar energy different latitudes receive at different times of year, in turn influencing the strength and reliability of monsoon systems, the extent of polar ice sheets, and the broader stability of regional climates across the entire planet. During certain phases of these long orbital cycles, the African monsoon, the seasonal wind and rainfall pattern responsible for much of the rain that reaches large parts of the continent, weakens considerably, sometimes for extended stretches lasting many centuries. When this happens, regions that ordinarily depend on reliable seasonal rains for their rivers, lakes and grasslands can experience exactly the kind of severe, sustained drying recorded in the Lake Malawi sediment cores. This is not a sudden, unpredictable event in the way a volcanic eruption is. It is a slow, grinding shift, unfolding gradually enough that no single generation would necessarily have perceived it as a single crisis, but cumulatively severe enough across many generations to fundamentally reshape the landscape and the resources available within it. Researchers studying these orbital cycles in relation to human evolution have proposed something they sometimes call the variability selection hypothesis, the idea that repeated cycles of dramatic climatic fluctuation across Africa, alternating between wetter and drier periods over many thousands of years, may have been a significant driving force in shaping the flexible, adaptable, cognitive and behavioral traits that came to characterize modern humans. In this view, our species' capacity for rapid behavioral innovation, for developing new technologies and new strategies in response to changing circumstances, may itself be, in part, a legacy of surviving through repeated cycles of exactly this kind of severe climatic instability, of which the period surrounding this particular bottleneck may represent one of the most extreme examples. This is a genuinely striking way of thinking about the relationship between the crisis and the eventual outcome, rather than viewing the difficult, unstable climate of this period purely as a threat that our ancestors barely managed to survive. Some researchers suggest it may also have been, in a longer and more indirect sense, a kind of pressure that helped shape exactly the qualities, flexibility, innovation, wide social networking, cultural transmission of complex skills that eventually allowed our species not merely to survive, but to expand successfully into nearly every environment on the planet in the tens of thousands of years that followed. None of this makes the difficulty of the period itself any less real or any less dangerous for the specific people who had to live through it, with no way of knowing whether the pressures they faced would ever ease, and no larger evolutionary perspective available to comfort them in the moment. But it does add a certain depth to the story, a sense that the very same forces threatening to end our species may also have been, in some slow and indirect way, part of what eventually made our species as resilient and adaptable as it has since proven to be. There is something worth sitting with in this slower, more grinding version of the story. It suggests that the survival of our species through this period was not primarily a matter of enduring one terrible event and then simply recovering afterward, the way a person might recover from a single injury. It was a matter of enduring, generation after generation, a world that had simply become harder, for reasons no one living through it could have fully understood or predicted, and finding again and again across many decades the accumulated knowledge and quiet resilience needed to keep going anyway. It's a slower kind of courage than the kind found in a single dramatic crisis. The courage of getting up morning after morning, across years and then decades of difficulty, and doing the ordinary work of survival anyway, without any way of knowing whether the difficulty would ever ease, or whether the small fire you tended each night would still be burning for your grandchildren, or whether it would simply, quietly, go out. There is a different way of approaching this mystery, one that steps away from ice cores and lake sediment for a while, and turns instead towards something more difficult to measure, but no less real. The way certain deep formative crises seem to leave an echo not only in DNA but in the stories a species tells about itself, long after the specific facts of the original event have been forgotten. When geneticists first began tracing human ancestry back through maternal and paternal lines, using mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA respectively, they gave the two most recent common ancestors of these lineages informal names that, whether the scientists intended it or not, borrowed directly from religious and mythological language. The woman from whom every living person's mitochondrial DNA descends came to be popularly known as mitochondrial Eve. The man from whom every living person's Y chromosome DNA descends came to be known as Y chromosome Adam. It is worth being precise about what these names actually mean, because the popular understanding often drifts towards something far more dramatic than the science supports. Mitochondrial Eve was not the only woman alive at the time she lived, nor was Y chromosome Adam the only man. They were not, as far as the evidence suggests, even necessarily alive at the same time as each other, and current estimates place them tens of thousands of years apart in some analyses. They were simply the specific individuals whose particular maternal or paternal genetic lines happened to be the only ones that, by chance and time, did not eventually die out along the way. Many other women and men living alongside them almost certainly contributed to our overall genetic ancestry, through other combinations of descendants. Only these two specific unbroken lines, the purely maternal and the purely paternal, happen to trace back to these particular individuals. And yet the fact that scientists reached instinctively for names drawn from the deepest, oldest human origin story in Western religious tradition says something interesting about how naturally our minds seem to reach for mythological language when trying to describe moments of profound narrowing and renewal in our own deep past. There is something in the structure of a genetic bottleneck, a population narrowing down to a small founding group before expanding outward again, that echoes, whether by coincidence or by something deeper, the shape of flood stories and near-extinction myths found across an enormous range of human cultures, separated by vast distances and by thousands of years of independent development. It is important to be careful here and honest about the limits of what can be responsibly claimed. There is no credible evidence that any specific surviving myth, anywhere in the world, represents a literal, transmitted memory of the population bottleneck of 74,000 years ago, or of the Toba eruption specifically. That period lies so far back in deep time, so many tens of thousands of years before the earliest known forms of writing, and so many generations before even the oldest oral traditions that can be traced with any confidence, that any direct chain of transmission connecting a specific ancient event to a specific surviving story would be effectively impossible to establish, and claims to the contrary should be treated with real skepticism. What is genuinely fascinating and worth sitting with as its own kind of mystery is simply how widespread and how strikingly similar in shape certain categories of ancient story turn out to be across cultures that had no plausible contact with each other. Stories describing a great flood, or a great darkness, or a catastrophic destruction of most of humanity, followed by survival and renewal from a small remaining group, appear independently in the mythological traditions of cultures across nearly every inhabited continent. Mesopotamian flood narratives, stories from cultures across the Pacific Islands, traditions among various indigenous peoples of the Americas, stories recorded across parts of Africa, Asia, and Europe, developed, as far as anyone can determine, entirely independently of one another. Consider for a moment the sheer geographical range across which flood and near-extinction narratives independently appear. Among certain Aboriginal Australian traditions, stories describe a great flood that destroyed most of humanity, leaving only a small remnant to repopulate the world. Among various Native American traditions across both North and South America, similar narratives describe catastrophic floods or darknesses from which only a small group of survivors emerged to begin humanity anew. In ancient Mesopotamia, the story of a great flood surviving in written form on cuneiform tablets predates, and likely influenced, the later flood narrative recorded in the Hebrew Bible. In Hindu tradition, the story of Manu, warned in advance of a coming deluge and instructed to build a vessel to preserve life through it, follows a strikingly similar narrative arc. None of these traditions had any plausible direct contact with one another at the time these stories are believed to have first taken shape. Some researchers who study comparative mythology have proposed that this striking pattern may reflect something less mysterious than it first appears, that stories of catastrophic near-destruction followed by renewal may simply be a natural and recurring shape for human storytelling to take, arising independently again and again because it reflects something universally true about the human experience of surviving hardship, disaster, and loss, regardless of any single specific historical trigger. A flood myth in one culture might reflect the very real, very local memory of a specific regional flood. A darkness myth in another might reflect a specific volcanic event, entirely different from Toba, that darkened the sky in that particular region at some point in that culture's own more recent history. The similarity in shape, in other words, may simply be because human beings, everywhere, tend to reach for similar narrative structures when trying to make sense of catastrophe and survival, not because any of these stories preserve a genuine, unbroken memory reaching back 74,000 years. But there is a gentler, less literal way of holding this connection that feels, at least to sit with quietly, genuinely meaningful rather than merely speculative. Whether or not any specific surviving myth traces back to this particular ancient crisis, it remains true that every single human culture that exists today, every single tradition of storytelling, every sacred text, every oral history passed down around fires, very much like the ones our ancestors kept burning 74,000 years ago, descends, without exception, from the same narrow population that survived this period. In that sense, and only in that sense, but in a sense worth honouring nonetheless, every flood myth, every story of a small remnant surviving against enormous odds and going on to rebuild the world, carries within it something true about our shared origin, even if the specific historical details were never literally transmitted across all those tens of thousands of years. We are quite literally the descendants of a small remnant that survived against long odds and went on to rebuild the world. It should perhaps not surprise us that this exact shape, narrowing and near loss followed by renewal and rebuilding, appears again and again in the stories we have told about ourselves ever since, across every culture, in every corner of the world our expanding ancestors eventually reached. Perhaps we carry this pattern instinctively, not because we remember the specific mountain or the specific drought, but because the shape of near loss and survival is, in some very real sense, written into what it has always meant to be human at all. There is one more thread worth following here, gentler still, and perhaps closer to genuine memory than any myth. It lies not in stories told in words, but in the deep, wordless memory carried inside the human body itself. Every person alive today carries, somewhere in their genome, the specific genetic signature of this ancient narrowing. Every one of us is, in the most literal and physical sense possible, a living artifact of this exact period of crisis and survival. Our very existence, our particular combination of genes, our specific inherited traits, all trace back, without exception, through this same narrow passage of deep time. There is a separate, more recent body of research worth mentioning here, one that has genuinely surprised many linguists and folklorists who once assumed that oral tradition simply could not survive intact across more than a few centuries, let alone millennia. Researchers studying indigenous Australian oral traditions have found accounts, passed down across many generations entirely without writing, that appear to accurately describe geographic features and coastal boundaries as they existed thousands of years before present, before rising sea levels at the end of the last glacial period submerged them. In several documented cases, traditional stories describe specific islands, now submerged beneath the sea, still existing as connected mainland, along with accounts of the flooding process itself, details that align remarkably well with what geological and sea level evidence independently confirms about the coastline at the time these floods actually occurred, thousands of years before any of these stories were ever written down by outside researchers. This does not mean, and it is worth repeating this caution clearly, that any specific story can be reliably traced back 74,000 years to the exact period of this particular population bottleneck. The timescales involved in the Australian coastal flooding accounts, while impressively long by any ordinary standard of oral transmission, are still considerably shorter than the span separating us from the Toba eruption and the population crisis surrounding it. But this evidence does meaningfully expand what many researchers now consider possible when it comes to the durability of carefully maintained oral tradition, particularly within cultures that developed specific structured mnemonic techniques, deliberate methods of preserving information with unusual precision across many successive generations, techniques that some traditional cultures maintained with remarkable rigour, precisely because they understood how easily important knowledge could otherwise be lost. It raises a gentle, open question, one that cannot currently be answered with any real confidence, but that is worth holding lightly rather than dismissing outright. If certain traditions, under the right cultural conditions, really can preserve accurate details across many thousands of years, is it entirely impossible that some very deep, very transformed echo of an ancient crisis, a period of scarcity, of a shrinking world, of survival against difficult odds, might have left some faint, unrecoverable trace somewhere in the deep layers of human storytelling, even if any literal details have long since been reshaped beyond recognition by the countless retellings separating us from the original event? There is no way to test this question with the evidence currently available. It may never be answerable at all. But it is, at the very least, a question worth sitting with quietly, rather than closing off entirely, given how much our understanding of the durability of oral tradition has already been revised in recent years. In that sense, perhaps the truest surviving text of this ancient crisis is not written in any language at all. It is written in us, in the shape of our chromosomes, in the quiet, patient patterns geneticists can still read, tens of thousands of years later, in the blood and cells of every person who has ever lived since, a memory none of us can consciously access, and yet one that every one of us carries forward regardless, generation after generation, simply by being here at all, simply by continuing the same unbroken thread that a small, scattered handful of people, huddled around small fires on a cold and uncertain coastline, somehow managed not to let break. There is a third possibility worth holding alongside the others, quieter and more uncomfortable than either the volcano or the drought, though not necessarily separate from them. It concerns not the climate and not the land, but other people. Specifically, the question of what happened when small, increasingly desperate populations, competing for an ever-shrinking pool of resources, came into contact with one another. It is important to say, gently and clearly, that direct archaeological evidence of large-scale conflict during this exact period is limited, and any account of this period that leans too heavily on violence as the central explanation is likely overstating what the evidence can actually support. There are no mass grave sites from this window definitively linked to warfare in the way later archaeological periods sometimes provide. The picture that exists is far more fragmentary and far more ambiguous than that. But it would also be a kind of dishonesty to imagine this period as one of pure harmony simply because the direct evidence of violence is sparse. A world in which resources were becoming scarcer, populations were shrinking, and different bands, and in some regions different species of ancient humans altogether, were competing for the same increasingly narrow margins of survivable territory, was almost certainly not, in every instance, a gentle one. Competition for the best coastal sites, the most reliable freshwater sources, the richest remaining hunting grounds, likely produced real tension, and in at least some cases, real conflict, even if the specific archaeological traces of that conflict have not survived, or have not yet been found in the sparse and incomplete record available from this period. It is worth considering too what territorial pressure would actually have looked like on the ground for a small band navigating this period, since the abstract idea of competition for resources can obscure just how immediate and personal that pressure would have felt in daily practice. A band that had for generations relied on a particular stretch of coastline, or a particular set of reliable freshwater springs, or a particular seasonal migration route used by the animals they hunted would have depended on that specific territory with an intimacy that is difficult for anyone accustomed to modern abundance to fully appreciate. The arrival of another band into that same territory, whether through displacement caused by drought elsewhere or through the ordinary expansion of a growing group seeking new ground, would not have been an abstract economic event. It would have been a direct, immediate question of whether there was enough food, water and shelter for everyone present, a question that, in a world already stretched thin by climatic pressure, may not always have had a peaceful answer. There is some suggestive evidence drawn from later periods closer to this one in time that violence between human groups, and potentially between different human species, was not unknown during the broader stretch of the late Pleistocene. Skeletal remains from various sites across this general era, though most post-date the specific window of the Bottleneck itself, sometimes show injuries consistent with interpersonal violence. And the broader pattern of what eventually happened to the other human species alive during this period, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and likely several other, less well understood populations, all of whom eventually disappeared entirely, leaving Homo sapiens as the sole surviving human lineage, raises real and still actively debated questions about the role competition, and possibly conflict, may have played in that eventual outcome. Some researchers argue this disappearance was driven primarily by more subtle, less violent mechanisms, gradual absorption through interbreeding, until distinct populations simply blended into the expanding human line rather than being displaced by force. Competitive disadvantage in adapting to a rapidly changing climate, allowing more flexible, more widely networked human populations to simply outcompete more specialized, more geographically restricted ones over many generations, without any single dramatic confrontation ever needing to occur. Others argue that direct conflict, at least in some regions and at some points, likely played a real role as well, even if the archaeological record from this specific window remains too sparse to fully confirm it. What can be said with more confidence is this: whatever combination of climate pressure, resource scarcity, and interspecies or intergroup competition our ancestors were navigating during this period, the populations that ultimately survived and eventually rebuilt appear to have been ones that favoured cooperation, wide social networks, and flexible adaptation over pure isolated self-interest. The evidence of long-distance contact between distant bands, the shared stone tool technologies appearing at sites separated by considerable distance, the genetic evidence of interbreeding between different human populations rather than pure hostile separation, all point toward a survival strategy built, at least in significant part, on connection rather than pure competition. This does not mean the period was free of conflict. It likely was not. But it suggests that whatever role competition and violence played during this crisis, it was not, in the end, the deciding factor in our species' survival. The deciding factor, as far as the evidence currently allows us to say, appears to have been something closer to the opposite: a persistent, stubborn willingness to maintain bonds across distance and difficulty, to share knowledge, to exchange partners and stories and technology, even during the hardest and most dangerous years, when pure self-interest might have counselled turning inward and trusting no one beyond the smallest immediate circle. It is worth looking more closely at what eventually happened to the Neanderthals specifically, since their story offers a kind of mirror, both similar to and different from our own, that helps illuminate what may have been at stake during this period for our own ancestors. Neanderthals were not primitive or unsophisticated by any reasonable measure. They controlled fire, made specialized tools well suited to their environment and their hunting strategies, cared for injured and elderly members of their communities in ways that required real cooperative investment, and, based on burial evidence at several sites, may have practiced some form of ritual treatment of their dead. For hundreds of thousands of years they thrived across Europe and Western Asia, adapting successfully to conditions, including the deep cold of glacial periods, that would challenge almost any population. And yet by roughly 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals had disappeared as a distinct population, their genetic legacy surviving today only as small, scattered fragments within the DNA of modern humans, descended from those early interbreeding events. The reasons for their disappearance remain genuinely debated, and almost certainly involved multiple contributing factors, rather than any single cause. Some researchers point to Neanderthal populations having remained smaller and more genetically isolated than expanding modern human populations, making them more vulnerable to exactly the kind of small population risks discussed earlier in this story: reduced genetic diversity, reduced resilience to disease and environmental change, a narrower margin for absorbing ordinary bad luck. Others point to direct competition for the same increasingly scarce resources during a difficult climatic period, with modern human populations potentially benefiting from wider social networks and more flexible technological adaptation, gradually outcompeting Neanderthal populations across shared territory over many generations. Still others emphasize the role of simple demographic momentum. Once modern human populations began expanding successfully, their sheer growing numbers may have made eventual absorption or displacement of smaller, more localized Neanderthal populations almost inevitable, regardless of any specific advantage in skill or technology. What makes this comparison so relevant to our central mystery is the reminder it offers of just how differently this same difficult period might have unfolded. Neanderthal populations faced many of the same broad pressures: a shifting, unstable climate, competition for resources, the compounding dangers of small population size, and in their case, those pressures ultimately proved insurmountable. Our own ancestors faced a genuinely comparable gauntlet of difficulty during this same broad window of deep time, and by whatever combination of fortune, accumulated knowledge, and flexible adaptation, narrowly came through it instead. The margins separating these two outcomes, extinction on one hand and survival however narrow on the other, may have been considerably smaller and more contingent than it is comfortable to imagine. It is worth pausing here, in this last theory, to widen the lens one final time and ask what all of this, taken together, actually leaves behind. Not simply as a scientific answer, because as we have seen, no single, tidy answer fully accounts for everything the evidence describes, but as something closer to a lesson, or perhaps simply an observation, about what our species carried with it through this narrow passage in deep time, and what it means that we are here at all to look back on it. What endures, from this period, is not any single explanation. It is a pattern, visible again and again across every piece of evidence we have gathered: adaptation over rigidity. Coastal populations who learn to read tides with extraordinary precision, rather than remaining bound to increasingly unreliable inland resources. Technological experimentation, like the patient heat treating of stone, that required stability and curiosity even under real pressure. Symbolic behavior, like the careful preparation of ochre pigment, that persisted even when survival alone might seem to have left no room for anything beyond the purely practical. And perhaps most of all, connection. The maintained threads between distant, isolated bands, the shared knowledge, the exchanged partners, the willingness to walk toward each other rather than simply retreating into isolated self-preservation. None of these things on their own explain the entire mystery, but together they begin to sketch a picture of what actually carried a fragile, narrowing population through one of the most difficult stretches our species has ever known. Not any single stroke of luck, and not any single act of heroism, but an accumulated, quiet pattern of resilience, curiosity, and connection, practiced daily by ordinary people, none of whom had any way of knowing that their small, unremarkable choices repeated across many generations were quietly determining whether an entire species would continue to exist at all. We will likely never know their names, we will likely never fully decode the marks they scratched into pieces of ochre, or understand the specific stories they told each other around their fires on the coldest nights. But we carry them forward anyway, in the shape of our chromosomes, in the patient patterns still readable in our blood, and perhaps in some gentler and less literal sense, in the very fact that we still tell stories about beginnings and endings and the small, stubborn continuation of things that manage, against long odds, not to break. Somewhere in southern Africa, a woman kneels at the mouth of a cave above a cold grey sea. The fire behind her has burned down to a low, steady glow. She sets the ground ochre aside, wrapped carefully in a fold of skin, ready for tomorrow. Behind her, the sound of the tide moves in and out against the rocks, patient, indifferent, exactly the same sound it has made every night for as long as anyone in her family can remember. She does not know that she is living through the narrowest passage her entire species will ever walk through. She does not know about the mountain on the far side of the world, or the ash still settling quietly into ice at both ends of the earth, or the long, dry decades pressing down on the rivers and grasslands far inland. She knows only the fire and the tide and the sound of the people she loves breathing steadily in their sleep nearby. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it was always enough. Not certainty, not any grand understanding of the scale of what was at stake, but simply the quiet daily insistence on continuing. One more fire kept lit, one more morning at the tide pools, one more piece of ochre ground carefully for reasons she may not have been able to fully explain even to herself. The mystery of what nearly ended us may never be fully solved. The volcano, the drought, the long, slow narrowing of a difficult world, all of it remains tangled together, evidence pointing in several directions at once, the way the truest and oldest mysteries so often do. But somewhere underneath all of the uncertainty sits one fact that needs no further proof at all. She survived. They survived. And so, improbably, impossibly, against every quiet danger stacked against them did we. Let the fire settle. Let the tide keep its old, unhurried rhythm against the rocks. Somewhere back along the thread of everything that ever happened to bring you here, listening to this in the dark, someone very much like her once closed their eyes beside a small flame, uncertain of tomorrow, and let themselves rest anyway. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. If you had to live through one long, uncertain winter with only a small fire and a handful of people you trusted, what is the one thing from your life now that you think you'd miss the most?